All right. So again, good evening, everybody. This is our second Boundary Review Committee meeting. This will be the first virtual session that we're going to be having as a group. And again, thanks for joining us last week in person when we had our kickoff meeting. So the purpose for this evening's meeting, again, as we alluded to last week, is really we're going to want to hear you speak and review these options together as a group. We do have quite a bit of not a long presentation, but we have a lot of opportunities for you to speak and share your thoughts on the preliminary options that we've shared. So without further delay, I'm just going to pass it over to Claire to read us the following. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. As Fred mentioned, I'm going to be, honoring the land tonight. And Halton, as we know it today, is rich in history and modern traditions of many First Nations in the Métis. From the Anishinaabe to the Attawandaron, the Haudenosaunee, and the Métis, these lands surrounding the Great Lakes are steeped in Indigenous history. As we gather today on these treaty lands, we have the responsibility to honor and respect the four directions: land, waters, plants, animals, ancestors that walk before us, and all the wonderful elements of creation that exist. We would like to acknowledge and thank the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation for sharing their territory with us. As a reflection, I was thinking about what it means to run an anti-colonial meeting, and it's a term that we use a lot. It involves creating a space where participants can engage in raising awareness of issues and have open discussions and active listening to each other. It involves creating an inclusive environment, ensuring that the meeting is accessible to all participants. It includes fulsome representation. We have trustees, parents, HDSB staff, and we hope each party in person can bring forward their thoughts and ideas from many other perspectives as well as their own. We want a holistic picture of the needs and the ideas that many share. It includes constructive, respectful dialogue and clear communication, asking each other probing questions and listening with care and empathy. Anti-colonial work is about dismantling oppressive structures and supporting the self-determination of marginalized communities. And it's crucial to approach these meetings with sensitivity and humility and a commitment to learning and the growth of all common goals and for all of our students. So with that, thank you. And I hand it back over to Fred.
Thanks, Claire. So as I alluded to earlier, we'll break this out into 4 different parts this evening as part of the presentation. So first, we'll do what we do at every meeting. We'll do some housekeeping items. We'll talk about what's new and bring up some subject matters that were standing items from last week's meeting. Afterwards, we're going to jump into a quick review of options 1 to 4. I want to look at, I'll show the maps again just to refresh your memory, and we're just going to update you on 2 specific school projections, and we'll get into that in a second. Afterwards, this is where we get into the meat and potato things. Part 3 is really the breakout session and group discussion. This is where we really want to hand it over to you, where we're going to break you out in the groups, have an overall discussion, and come back as a larger group to debrief. And afterwards, the last step for this evening will be next steps and just preparing ourselves for next week's meeting. So housekeeping items for this evening. So a couple things have occurred since our last meeting. We have done some updates to the projections in the charts. So based on our discussion last week for Dr. David R. Williams, we wanted to make sure that we reflected the 24 portable max as it currently stands, acknowledging that over time we want to change that back to 18 because that's what we feel is more sustainable and the best operations for that school. Oakville Northeast number 5, we definitely want to adjust we had a discussion about whether or not the addition is going to get funded. So we'll definitely present it in such a way now where you can see where the max capacity would lie for both the addition and not having the addition. So we can future-proof the options that we're going to be considering. Post corners right now, we've started the implementation of the change at 2024, assuming that Oakville number 3 will open in time. And last but not least, there was a request that was made to get zone projections specifically for post corners. So what we did is we developed zone projections for all of the zones, so that way you all have access to the same information, and that will lead into an opportunity to further develop options as a group, and we'll get into that later this evening. In terms of another housekeeping item is tonight is going to be a virtual meeting, a little bit of a different setting as last week, but really the same decorum as what we expect in terms of, open conversation and a respectful conversation to lead to a consensus building process. For those of you that are not familiar with Google Meets, there's just a few things to take note of. when you're not speaking, and it seems like everybody's already used to it by now with COVID, and I'm sure you've been doing this with your children. But when you're not speaking, turn off your microphone. If you have a question, we're going to use the hands up approach, just so that, especially when you're breakout sessions or you have questions, the facilitators can acknowledge you and address you. If you don't want to have your video on, again, it is a video recording. It will be on live on the website. Feel free to toggle it off. We're going to stop frequently like we did last week for questions. So, I'll take a breath or a little sip of water, and feel free to jump right in and ask some questions. If you want, you can also turn on the captions in case, it just helps you in terms of following along in the presentation. I try to avoid it, but if you need to, feel free to throw in some comments through the comment box that you'll find in the bottom right of the screen, or the top right there. And then in terms of the layout button, so depending on how you have it set up, what you prefer, seeing that it's a large presentation, I recommend hitting the 3 little dots on the bottom of your screen there, clicking on the change layout setting, and usually spotlight or sidebar is a good one to go with. The spotlight will focus on the presentation itself and what's on screen, and then you can have the sidebar of other members speaking, or you can have a spotlight and it just focuses on the presentation itself. In terms of today's goals, we want to, again, review the options 1 through 4, maps and the updated graphs, breakout session. I want to have a nice, good debrief and good discussion amongst all of us afterwards, and then go through next steps. We have circulated the minutes from the last meeting. If you haven't had a chance to, feel free to make any changes, and please forward those recommendations over to us, and then we can approve them. If not tonight, maybe at the next meeting, once you've had another chance to look at them. And last but not least, we've had, as I alluded to earlier, we had an information request for additional data on zone projections. So we have since provided that. And there was also a request about, how are we dealing with before and after care? So briefly, what I'll say is that typically when we go through a boundary review process, what we do is we advise the before and after care of what option is going to be implemented, and let them know as to what the impacts are in terms of movement of students, and they do their best to accommodate. That's the best I can give for you tonight. But for next week, we've spoken with our coordinator that deals with childcare and before and after at the board. And what she's done is she's reached out to our providers at the affected sites to get a little bit more details and information as to what their capacity is in terms of accommodating, additional growth or students or changes throughout time. So we're going to come back next week with more fulsome information. Again, you've got your folders that's been shared by Mitch and Lorene in terms of finding all of your information. So everything that we post, we will be providing it within those folders. In terms of the next meetings, again, we have our meeting this evening and another one next week. By next week, we're going to gauge as to whether this schedule will be able to adhere to, or whether or not we need some additional meetings and may need to adjust accordingly. So we'll know more next week, I'd say. All right, part 2. So I'm going to get into the overview of the options very quickly. If you recall, last week we had 3 themes, or well, let's call it 4 themes. We had status quo, which is do nothing, which we can't really move ahead with. Option 1 was our control scenario, where we wanted to demonstrate to you what it looks like when you don't remove any FI in the north. Option 2 was a reduction of FI in the north and just having Dr. David R. Williams as a dual track school, but within its own boundaries, so not drawing in from other students. And options 3 and 4 were the complete removal of FI in the north, and then focusing on our schools to the south in order to accommodate. So our control option here for the English boundaries, I'll go over this quickly. For Palermo, it remains relatively unchanged. River Oaks, its existing boundary is changed in terms of its entire holding area north of Dundas is moved both at Oakville number 5, and a portion of it would be going to the new Oakville number 3 elementary school. In terms of what it's receiving, it'd be receiving 2 zones from Post Corners to increase its enrollment that it lost from holding. Afterwards, Post Corners, as mentioned, there would be 2 zones would be redirected. Falgarwood remains relatively unchanged south of Dundas. North of Dundas, the entirety of its holding area would go to Oakville number 3. Dr. David R. Williams' boundary would send over 1 area of residential development to Unawi, and then the remainder would go to Oakville 5. FI wise, the only real change here is that the holding area that's currently at River Oaks that was going to Sunningdale, we would direct that to Forest Trails. In terms of the numbers, we did adjust River Oaks and Post Corners to show what it will look like if we implemented this the following year, assuming that Oakville 3 opens. So in this case, with the removal of holding and and receiving additional enrollment from Post Corners, we're above the built capacity, but slightly below maximum capacity and stabilizing over time, but having quite a bit of room left over long term. Post Corners, we see a drop for 2024, and the enrollment stays relatively stable over time, but it is about 50% and above in terms of its overall portable usage. Option number 2 is where we first reduce FI. In terms of holding area, what we're doing is we're sending a large proportion of the holding area to Oakville number 5. That's unchanged. Where we start changing the English boundaries, we're adding a little bit more to River Oaks in terms of increasing its numbers and trying to reduce the pressure at Post Corners. Falgarwood, we're removing less holding. Really, we're just going to try to establish a more neighborhood level boundary for Oakville number 3 because we saw a huge spike in enrollment over time. So that way here for Falgarwood, they're going to keep holding to the north until we get Oakville number 4. Oakville number 5 boundary stays the same. Dr. Dave R. Williams is the same as option number 1. In terms of FI, this is where we start cutting away. So the only major difference here is that we're taking this area here, that's Udnowie and Oakville number 5, we're sending all that to Forest Trail. A portion now is going to Sunningdale that is now going to Forest Trail. And then Palermo, we're sending over additional students to try to uplift their numbers. In terms of River Oaks and Post Corners, now that we're sending a little bit more high density growth to River Oaks, we see that we're staying in and around the same utilization, which is right at the building capacity. And in terms of Post Corners, we succeeded in removing a lot of the portable pressure that was at that school long term. So again, that initial year, we're dropping that pressure quite a bit, again, assuming Oakville number 3 opens. In terms of option number 3, this is where we completely remove FI in the north. In this case here, a lot of the English track boundaries are one and the same as we just looked at, so I won't go over that again. FI, instead of having Dr. David R. William having its own FI dual track program that's the same as its English track boundary, here we're now sending it over to Sunningdale. In terms of the numbers for River Oaks and Post Corners, they remain the same as they were in option number 2, where we remove a lot of pressure at Post Corners, where we're almost at no portables. In River Oaks, we get to the point where we might be at 1 or no portables long term. Last but not least, option number 4 is a further iteration or similar to option number 3. A major change here is that we're directing some of this high density growth over to River Oaks, and we're maintaining the zone AH to Post Corners, which is a little bit closer in terms of distance. Otherwise, the FI boundary, the only real change to option number 3 is that this corner here will now go to Sunningdale, just so that we can align cohorts. And the numbers for River Oak and Post Corners, again, are the same as option 3. So those have no changes based on the difference between option number 3 and 4. Before I move on, I'll just ask, a little spot check. One okay with the overview, or were there any questions that came up since last meeting that need clarification at this point in time? Or all right, I'll assume that we are good. So I'll move on to part 3. So we're going to be doing some, as I mentioned last, we're going to be doing some jam boards, and we're going to be doing some Mentimeters to kind of gauge, what your thoughts are on 2 things this evening. The one is going to be the criteria. So we definitely want to see what your perspectives are on the criteria, as well as, are there additional criteria you need to consider, or facets of criteria that we've listed that we want to expand on or further clarify that's more contextual to your school environment or your school community. The way the format of tonight's meeting is going to go, we're going to have a facilitator in the group with you, as well as trustees and superintendents, as well as yourselves as parent representatives. Our facilitators will be prompting questions with you just to start the conversation, and afterwards you'll be providing them with your thoughts, again using hands up, just so that you can join in, or we can have a little bit of a good orderly conversation. And what we'll do is we'll put little post-its on that reflect your thoughts. And then afterwards, the intent is we're going to come back as a group and we're going to debrief and have a wider conversation. And we're also going to throw in a Mentimeter survey too, just to kick us off. So I just get your devices ready again, like we did last week, just to take the screen cap when we're ready to go on that. So for tonight, we pre-selected 3 groups, 4 to 5 people a group, depending how it shook out and who could attend this evening. And just again to note, you've got parent reps, you have trustee representation, as well as planning staff representation there to assist with facilitating. Lorene and myself will be the floaters this evening. We're going to jump from breakout room to breakout room and do some spot checks, see if there's any assistance or if there's any clarification that's needed. If a question comes up or something conversation gets stumped on a certain matter, our staff is going to be able to give Lorene and I a heads up to come join the meeting. So you'll see us bounce around here and there, and we're there to provide assistance and answer questions if need be. All right, so with that, our first breakout session, like I mentioned, this is one where last week we had a brief discussion around the criteria we use to weigh the effectiveness of the options that we're going to present and gauge based on the community's perception of what a good outcome of boundary review process is going to be, and align that with what options we're going to be developing. So I won't go into too much detail for the criteria tonight, but just to remind you, we have viability of program, stable long-term boundaries, temporary accommodation portables. How do we mitigate the use of those? Being fiscally sustainable and make sure that we're not expending too much resources on things that could otherwise go into the classroom themselves. Have regard for geographic boundaries and areas to make sure that it makes sense. These boundaries do have some logic to them where possible. Being proximate to the schools where you reside. Balance enrollment overall, so we're minimizing empty space and maximizing the use of our buildings, reducing portable use, minimize transportation requirements, try to have kids walk to school or be close enough to walk to school. Student experience is a big one. This ties in with well-being, mental health, transitioning, and all of those components, and making sure that whatever changes that we do make, we have the ability, we're going to be able to make sure that's a smooth transition for our students. And others are going to be the ones we're going to discuss tonight. All right, so for the first, Rachel?
I'm not in one. I wasn't listed in any of those groups. I mentioned to Mitchell I couldn't make it next week, so I wonder if maybe he thought I could make it tonight.
Could have been that. Mitchell, you got
sure I didn't miss myself. Yeah.
Yep, just based off of attendance tonight, I've adjusted the groups. So I managed to put you in one. Sorry about that.
Okay, no, that's okay.
All good. We notice anyways when we do the breakout, like who's missing, so we were throwing you in. But thanks for letting me know, Rachel.
Thanks.
All right, so first things first, we're not going to switch the groups between both breakout sessions. So for the first few minutes, I'd say maybe just do a quick round of introductions, who's who. I know we did it last week, but maybe just if we have any new attendees this week, feel free to do so. And then for 15 minutes, what you'll do is the facilitator have the Jamboard up on the screen. You can also post it on your screen as well if you want. This goes for the next breakout session too, just to see what's going on. And yeah, we're going to review the boundary review criteria, have an open discussion on which ones you think are more important and how they weigh amongst one another. At the end of the meeting, and it'll be the same for the next breakout session, pick a moderator from your group, 1 or 2 or whoever, doesn't matter who it is. I'd prefer parent representation, but if you don't feel comfortable yet, by all means, you can ask one of the trustees or staff that are with you in the group to just kind of give a brief overview of what you discussed as a group. And we'll come back as a larger group and populate a Jamboard just so that we have that as part of the record. So that'll be the first breakout session. So the 2 questions that we're going to be asking is kind of to weigh the criteria they're presented. Like, how do you feel they align with one another? What's more important? What's less important? And then, are there any other criteria or components of those criteria that you want to make sure are expressed? So, as an example, when we talked about student experience, maybe to further enhance on that one, be like, okay, well, we really want to focus on student well-being because that's a component of the student experience, and you can expand on that as an example. Before we break out, any questions, or are we all ready to just jump right in and give it a go? All right, I'll take silence as we're ready to go. So Mitch, if you can get us loaded up and broken into our groups. So how this works is everybody's going to get dispersed into their groups. We'll time it, and we'll give you probably a 30-second heads up if we're about to disband the groups, because we're coming up near the end of the time that we have for that component. If you're starting to feel like the conversation's running dry a bit, we'll be in communication with another, and we might just come back as a larger group if need be, or we'll take the time that we need. So no pressure, take the time, at least 15 minutes on this one to go through it, and we'll go from there. All right, welcome back, everybody. So I was a little abrupt. We had the little timer up top. I should let you know. So yeah, welcome back to the group. I was, fortunate enough to kind of jump back and forth and see the group discussion, and it was varied and it was quite active. So I'm happy to see that. And if you were kind of cut off in the mid thought or something, we're going to have an opportunity here as a larger group to discuss it together again. So the next step right now is we're going to put the Jamboard up, and I'm just wondering, just hands up, who would like to volunteer as the first group. What we'll do is I'm going to put your slide up that you were working together as a group. You can go over some of the items in the background. Lorene, Mitch, and Michelle will be on the other slide populating some Post-its. So as you're discussing, we can put them in and you have something to reference. And then afterwards, we'll make sure that what we've posted on your group is accurate and complete. And then we'll move on to the next group. So who wants to kick us off? It's a larger group discussion. Ola? And if you let me know what group you're in, I'll put that up on the screen.
Group. So I think we were in group 2. I think Ola, you might be on mute.
You're on mute, Ola.
Hello?
Oh, there we go.
Okay. We discussed that there are some of the criteria that we believed are like go hand in hand or overlap with each other. So like stability of long-term boundaries, which is a very important thing, is very similar to the student experience because they both represent the fact that you don't move the student a lot, which I recall from the last meeting that some of the ladies were mentioning that their kids have already been moved more than once and they're young. So this is why we put them next to each other. So they are as important, and if they have to be listed in order, they just come right in under each other. Same thing goes for the balance of overall enrollment with the viability of the programs. Because that's also very important in terms of making sure that the programs have enough people and there's enough resources for the students and not to be not to have any shortage, even underutilization as well. Then comes the portables, which is indirectly related to the student experience, not in the sense that it's defined in terms of how many moves, but in terms of the student experience, like if you want to go to mental health and even the proper utilization of the resources that are available. There's a lot of links between the criteria. You can't really separate them 100%. But if there is portables, it means the school is approaching its maximum, if not exceeding, and then that means that the gym, the bathrooms, everything is being pressured, which affects everybody's experience. Then we moved on to the geographic boundaries. which would be ideal if we have a neighborhood and then all the students of that neighborhood of those streets go together, not having someone on this side of the road goes to River Oaks while the other side of the road goes to Ordinawi for some reason and their neighbors. That would be an ideal situation for the kids to be all together and not try to send people from another zone, from zone B to zone A, for example, or zone 1 to zone 2. Regarding the proximity to school, when we discussed this, there was a lot of comments that why is it less important? Although it's really nice to be able to walk to school, but the comments were that even though a lot of people might be already living next to the school, maybe due to weather conditions, maybe due to the age of the kids, people are still, or parents are still driving their kids to school. So this is why it went down a bit in the priority, because there are other things that we thought are more important. And then the maximization of cost effectiveness for the transportation and fiscal sustainability came in.
Thanks for that, Ola. That was a good summary. And we'll move on to the next group, and then we'll have everything itemized at the back end afterwards, and we'll have that as the record. Just
Okay.
acknowledge we're a little bit short on time tonight, so I want to make sure we got time to get into the options too. So again, thanks for being first, Ola. I know it's always a hard one to go up front, so appreciate that. Who's next? Group 1 or 3 want to kick off the next discussion? I'll give you another like 3 minutes to kind of give us a brief synopsis. Sorry, I just saw your hand pop up there. Mactus, did I get that right?
Yes, you did. I can't remember what group we were in.
3.
If anyone else remembers.
Group three,
Three.
Magda.
There we
Group
go.
3. Okay, so for us, our list was very similar to Ola, and I think our bottom 2 are exactly the same. The only thing was for transportation requirements, we said that if we're busing the children that are in the north to the south for French immersion, the cost would only be mainly on that. So that's why it says more for FI right next to that. But our main priority was that children should be able to stay in a long-term boundary, and they should get the benefits of all the programs available and all that stuff. So very similar to Ola. I'm going to go through every single one.
And I know as a group, you were a lot more FI schools. I think it was Forest Trail, Munns, and Sunningdale in your group. But what's your FI perspective in terms of, maybe the different reality you have as a school, being more in a transported area and being a holding school? Anything else you want to add on that, or?
Well, we were discussing just before we came back to the main group that was it discussed that FI and English should be in each school, like because you guys have all the statistics and everything of how many English stream students there are, how many FI students there are. Did you guys take that into consideration when you were making these maps up and deciding whether that was even an option? Like, for example, kids that are going to Munns right now, as an example, are there children from the Munns area that are being sent for English to a different area? I know Munns itself is just a French school, but I mean from the surrounding area. So would it not make sense to have, especially one of the new schools, maybe in the north, be both French and English? That way, Sir David Williams, they would possibly have some of the French immersion kids could go back to, if they are coming from the other north, the new north area, if they're coming from there, they could go to that school. Or I don't know, was that something that was discussed?
And we'll get more into it when we're talking about the option, but we were kind of alluding to it a little bit more, where one of the limitations we have, especially in the north, is like if you're drawing from multiple areas, it accelerates the growth of the school itself, like what's being witnessed at Dr. David R. and them having to take Udnawi on, especially because it's a high growth environment. And to your earlier point with, did we look at making all schools dual track? I think that would fall a little bit outside of the scope of this review. That would almost be a full French immersion review to see if we have to reestablish dual track schools and reestablishing that program, which I think would go a little further beyond. So I think with that, what I'll say is we're going to let the FI program, we're still studying that piece of it. And I think that would be a much larger endeavor. That would be a board-wide initiative to see if that's, or even just a municipal-wide initiative. So it's a little bit out of scope for this review, but I think it's certainly something that'll be explored once the north stabilizes a bit, and if there's an opportunity to reassess once things have slowed down a bit in North Oakville in 5+ years.
Okay.
We'll get into that, I'm sure, in the next, if not this evening, the next meetings to come.
Okay.
Thanks for that. And last but not least, from group number 1, if we have somebody that'd like to join in and just provide their perspective on this. I think Rachel?
Yeah, I can be brief. I think our priority criteria were a little bit different than the other groups, although many of them are interrelated. So we had student experience and proximity to schools as being the top 2. So really minimizing the number of moves and having students be able to walk to school. This also is directly related to transportation requirements, fiscal sustainability. So that was where the bulk of our conversation resided. I think there's some skepticism about whether stable long-term boundaries is actually realistic. So we talked about that a little bit. We did talk also about fiscal sustainability, and in reference to the previous discussion, it was raised that it's more expensive to have FI at every school. So that was interesting, obviously, like supplies and teachers and whatnot. But yeah, the bulk of our conversation was around student experience and proximity to schools, keeping students together, walkability, and cohorts staying together.
Thanks, Rachel. And yeah, that's certainly something we can explore a bit further in the next meetings in terms of what it means with the FI and some of the difficulties we have in spreading it out everywhere, and how we're trying to manage that in terms of our resources, not just fiscally, but in terms of availability of the teachers, staff, and having somebody to provide that quality programming. So thank you everybody for taking part of this. So what we'll do next is what we'll do now is we looked at the qualitative and we looked at kind of that experiential side of things. So now we're just going to quantify and give ourselves a sense of where we are in terms of our priorities individually. So we'll do a quick Mentimeter. If you just want to take this little QR code here, and I'll jump on the Menti slide. And the question here is going to be, where we'll do 2 things. One is just with a scale 1 to 5, how important is this criteria in terms of your perspective and your community perspective? And we'll go on to the next question, which is a word cloud. And hopefully by 8 o'clock, we can move on to our next breakout session. So if you go to menti.com and you use the code 75080524, and then you'll be able to answer this. And we'll go give you guys a couple minutes to log in. Here, for convenience, I threw it on the in the comment section too. You can access it from there as well. I give another 30 seconds, and you can continue on even if I've finished the or changed the slide or moved on, so we can don't feel too rushed. We've got about 11 respondents on this question, and then like I said, give another 30 seconds, and we'll move on to the next question real quick. And this, based on the 13 responses I've gotten so far, it seems to align quite well with, you know, what we've just been discussing in terms of the values and the importance that we're placing on, you know, student experience, the stability of boundaries, which ties in the balance of enrollment. And yeah, proximity to schools and geographic areas and barriers. I would have expected that a little bit higher, but it's I definitely see it within the context of this group that it's a little bit middle of the pack. So we're really prioritizing that student experience. So. And what's useful here is, and what's going to help us guide the discussion around the options is when we're looking at an option, now we have an idea of what criteria as a group we've discussed we want to evaluate those options based on. So if we have an option that, hey, great, we've reduced all portables, but it's very negative on the student experience because we're moving kids constantly, that would be an example of how we can apply this. So thanks for your comments, everyone. And for the next question, this is more of a word cloud. So I'll leave this open so you guys can continue on after I present it. But, you know, this is something where you don't necessarily don't express what school you're at, but you can just kind of give an idea of, you know what, this is what our communities really feels is important. So you can throw in a couple of factors here and we'll just generate a word cloud. And that'll help us kind of give an idea of, you know, where your heads are at in terms of where you're evaluating each of the options that we're bringing together. Again, all this is going to be part of the minutes, so we're going to have a record of, you know, these items that we've discussed as a group. All right. Again, keep populating that, and we'll move on to prepping for the next part of the meeting. Getting some good responses here. Thanks for that, everyone. So our second breakout session, so as you're doing that, I'll just speak. So here we're going to take a wider amount of time. We're short a bit, so let's see where the conversation leads us, and maybe we'll, if we all reach consensus that we want to take a little bit more time, maybe an extra 15 minutes this evening, we'll do that. So I'll say maybe for this one, we'll take another 20 minutes, and we'll go over the 4 options that we discussed last week, options 1, 2, 3, and 4. And as part of this, essentially, you'll be having the same discussion amongst yourselves and recalling the options that we reviewed last week. How well does that option meet those criteria, and what are some of the things it does well, it doesn't do well, where it can be improved on, and if possible, we'll see if we have time for this evening. Do we see any potential tweaks we'd like to see to an option? Would you see there being an opportunity? You know, for a zone to be changed to another school, or saying option 4 and saying, well, instead, can we send zone A to another area? So having that as part of the discussion is something that staff can look at. And if it doesn't get addressed tonight, then what we can do is provide us with some of your thoughts or some additions that you'd like to see. And then staff, if you provide that before noon on Monday, we'll be able to generate some of those additional options for next week. There's an exercise we have planned this evening, but if we run out of time, we might just have to defer it to next week. So with that, Rachel?
I make a quick comment. If we know that option 1 is not being considered, is there any point in talking about it?
If you want, it's up to you as a group. If you see some value somewhere in option 1, you can note it, but it's free form. You don't have to start from 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. You can just kind of focus on it. Wherever the group goes, that's where you'll go.
Thanks.
Thanks for that question, though. That's a great point to bring up, Rachel. All right. So with that, if everyone's ready, we'll jump into our next breakout session. All All right, welcome back, everybody. So I know we're at time right now, we're running a little bit over, so I'm going to ask the question: is everybody good? Maybe just to take the last 15 minutes to wrap up, and maybe we'll ask again at 8:45. If anybody objects, you want to throw up your hand, or just throw in a text or a comment. Pardon. All right, with that, then I'll just we'll get ourselves going here. So similar to the last go around, what I'll do is I'll throw up the Jamboard session up on the screen. And is there any volunteers that'd like to go first this time around? Jessica?
I am speaking for group 1, and we didn't discuss option 1. We discussed option 2. What we like about option 2 is that it does keep some FI north of Dundas, and what we don't like about it is it doesn't really meet the goal of balanced enrollment, and it also divides the FI, the existing students in the DDW FI program, because HG would be split from MNL. We discussed that option 3 and 4 are very similar. The primary difference being in the English program, and we preferred the English program in option 4 because it keeps AI, AH, and AF together and increases the chance of walkability for those students. And the other sort of difference between the English in option 3 and 4 is the X, Y, and Z students. And either option requires those students to be bused. So in terms of proximity and student experience, it's a wash for those students as between the options. So we did have a modification of option 4 to propose. The proposal is that for the English program, N is moved moved into the DDW boundary, so that the English boundary for DDW would be M, N, and L. And in the French immersion program, H and G would be added to Sunningdale, which would keep the entire existing DDW FI student body together. They would all move together to Sunningdale rather than being split between Sunningdale and Forest Trail. And in order to then balance enrollment at Sunningdale, we would propose that AC be moved into the MUNS boundary because AC would improve walkability, would have improved walkability to MUNS. So that would meet the proximity goal. And then there was a further option, which is a modification of the modification, where we wanted to try moving the X, Y, Z students in the English program into the DDW boundary to see whether in option 4, the DDW enrollment is it. I mean, I don't want to go so far as say low, but pretty low considering where it is today. And just as a thought exercise to see whether we could absorb those students, and it would perhaps improve walkability, maybe even just for the older students. We're not exactly, we acknowledge that Trafalgar is perhaps not, is an issue for a walking web, But to see if those kids can also fit comfortably at DDW, it might be it might feel more proximate than them being bused to River Oaks. Those are our comments.
All right, thank you for that. And then yeah, we'll definitely take those variations under review. So we'll have a look at them, and like I said, we'll see how the night goes, and maybe we'll be able to do an exercise to have a look. Any other thoughts, or we're good to move on to the next group? All right, who's the next volunteer? Group 2 or 3? How about we go with group number 3?
Okay, so I think we discussed mainly options 3 and 4. And we thought that they were very similar to each other. The only thing is we were thinking that maybe N in option 3 could go into number 5, like it is in like it is in option 4, and then yeah, and then switch the X, Y, and Z to number 3. So just kind of switch those two. I think that's what we discussed. Oh yes, and also AH. We said that AH could be part of River Oaks. We were happy with that if that was in option 4. So in option 4, AH is part of Post Corners. So we were thinking if AH could be part of River Oaks. Because those children, first of all, we don't know. I think that's still developing. So there aren't really any kids coming from there that are going to Post Corners. So we would want them to just start at River Oaks, and that would be a good long-term kind of plan for them. So they could stay in one school for a long time. I think that was about it. Did anyone want to add anything?
No, you covered it all, Magdas. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Magdas. So then we'll move on to group number 2. Allison?
Yeah, so very similar to that, we had AH in option 4 also going to River Oaks, or the potential for it to go to Falgarwood instead, but moving it out of the Post Corners, which would also give us some room to grandparent some students and free up some of the space at Post Corners, like maybe get more of the library back. And then there was questions we talked about that high density area in terms of AH, and that the numbers seem to be pretty good in option 2. But yeah, we were starting to like go forward and talk about grandparenting and stuff that we'll get to it in the future.
And absolutely, yeah. So for grandparenting, or what we call legacy exemption now, we're trying to move away from that. I get it. No worries.
Yeah.
It's been ingrained in me for the last 10 years. So yeah, for that, we're that's usually something we look at after we've kind of honed down on the options, because we definitely don't want to build options that are strictly just accommodating grandparenting or legacy exemption, because then we're right back at it once they're out of the system. But it's certainly something we're going to look at after we've honed into a few options, usually after the PIM, and they're like, okay, well, how much can we do on that? So it's certainly part of the discussion. All right. Thanks everyone for that, the discussion and the synopsis on your options. We're a little bit low on time, but what I'm thinking is and I think we're good to proceed with next steps. I think we've done quite a bit here, in terms of discussing all of the options. And again, I know this was quite the heavy night in terms of all the material that you're reviewing and what you're looking at and the perspective. So what I'd encourage you to do, here's the Mentimeter. What we'll do is, access it right now. I'll load it up, and then you can take the time to do it at your leisure. We don't have to wait for it right now. And the outcome of that, we'll review it as part of the next meeting. And if for this round too, if I can just get the parent representatives focusing on this more so, I just want to get your perspective on how you think each of the options are meeting the criteria. So let's just make sure you have access to it. So Mitch, if you don't mind, if you can just make it so that it's accessible to, and they don't have to wait for me to present to it. Thank you. So we're already going on to that. I'm going to move on to next steps. So next steps, again, we have our meeting next week. And I think for the focus of next week, what I'd like to do is we've got some homework to do in planning. We've taken some of your options right now, and we're gonna have a look at them. And we're going to see what's viable. We're going to put together, the same brief as we did here. I think we've got 3 new options, and based on the discourse that we had this evening, maybe planning will throw in a couple in its own making too as we review the numbers. And I think we're going to have more of an interactive session where we'll brainstorm some new ideas and some new options as we go forward, and then see if we can come down with a list of options that we feel comfortable with. And that would take us to the next meeting in November, where we'll have to make a decision whether we're going to, depending on how next week goes at the end, I think we're going to make a call as to whether we're ready to move on to the next meeting, which will be which options do we select to present to the community. And if not, if we need more time, then we'll take the time to get this right. I do also want to say, like, I really encourage, the thoughtfulness in terms of, developing options. Lorene and Marie, in terms of getting all the information together, has provided you those zone breakdowns for the options. So I think that'll give you a little bit of insight as you're looking at the options of if you want to pull one zone or not. It'll give you a sense of how many numbers you're taking away or adding. And we'll use that as part of the exercise next week to do it as well, so that you can see it like on the spot of what it looks like. And, throw us ideas. We're open to it. Again, this is our first cut based on our lens on what we perceive boundaries to be and what we're trying to achieve as a board, which a lot of it is on that long-term sustainability and maximizing student experience. Like, we don't want to be moving kids over and over again, but we want to take your perspective too, because as we discussed earlier, how you weighed the criteria is not necessarily what I've seen in other bound reviews or what I expected. So it's good and encouraging to see that there's different perspectives here and adapting to that. So yes, again, I do appreciate the time you've taken tonight. I look forward to our next meeting next Thursday. And before I close it off for this evening, were there any additional questions, comments, or suggestions that you'd like to make as a group on, just to give us some insight for our next meeting? Jessica? Just your mic.
Sorry, I was just going to suggest that if perhaps when the time comes to discuss legacy exemption, because it's such a hot button issue, if perhaps a primer on what the current sort of criteria are would be valuable, so that we all know what we're talking about when we say legacy exemption, when the time comes to discuss that.
Absolutely. We can even touch on that as a housekeeping item for next week, if that's a question you'd like to bring up as to, and just so I'm clear, so I make sure I answer your question. That's more of a, what have we done in the past? What are we trying to do? Like, how do we determine how many grades we can legacy exempt? That kind of thing. Like, do we provide transportation or not? Are those kind of the components you're looking for?
Yeah, exactly. How can a student or a family sort of qualify for legacy exemption, and what does it look like if they do?
Absolutely, we can definitely do that.
Because it might be that looking at those criteria, for example, even if it's not currently a criteria, if we expand the criteria, if this is going to be your third move in 2 years, then maybe you are eligible for legacy exemption. Or if you're going to end up with 4 children at 3 schools as a result of this, then you might be eligible for legacy exemption. For example, those might be things that we discuss.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I'll say very quickly, we're going to deal with that, and I'll get to you, Mark, in a second. We are cognizant of how many moves have happened in the past. And a lot of times we will base that of if you've already moved, we're going to try to avoid moving you at all costs, unless it's absolutely necessary. But I think in this scenario here, and Lorraine, correct me if I'm wrong, we're pretty fortunate we might be able to avoid it for the most part. That it won't be multiple, like it won't be 3 times. Maybe it's been your second, but yeah, we'll confirm that next meeting. Mark?
It sounds like you might have answered a little bit of my question, because you said that the legacy question will be dealt later on when the options are chosen. So I was just
Shortlisted.
Yes, is that the how you plan on creating that legacy? Is that something that we have an input on, or is that just strictly a board thing?
No, it's so all after we have our public information meeting, that's where we're going to have a sense as to what boundary options are best received by the community, and ideally by then you'll have 1 or more options, and it's at that point say, okay, well option 6 is the one that we feel is the best. Now, what can we do for legacy exemption? Because we're definitely going to hear from the community. Like, I'm not going to make any illusions of that. And then it'll be a question, well, how much can we potentially provide for legacy exemption without kind of running counterintuitive to the purpose of the boundary review, which is to attenuate pressure. So, if we grant legacy exempt everybody, then it doesn't work. So, it's kind of what Amy had mentioned last week is, we'll see how much we can go. And if it can be accommodated, then we'll definitely consider that. And that goes then to the BRSC, then to the director to make a determination as to what they recommend to the whole board of trustees. Agnes?
So just before we go, I just wanted to say, so these 4 options that you've given us, they can only be, tweaked a little bit, but you've already kind of told us that there's not going to be any option of having like a dual track school, especially in the north area. But that being said, are we, is that something that we still have a right to like vote on or something, like the parents that are involved in this, or is that something you, as whatever your role is, have already decided?
No, it's part of the process. What we've demonstrated in terms of options, option 1 is that like we can't leave it as is. There's a major issue.
Yeah.
And adding a number of additional dual track schools in the north, like if we want to look at it, the problem runs into, if we're doing it everywhere, then we're going to run into a resource issue with staffing. We're not going to have enough French immersion teachers to do the job. And I want to go back to your earlier statement too. It's not just a matter of tweaking. Like you can start moving zone, like Group 1 had done earlier when Jessica presented. You can definitely move zones around. Like usually what we do is we use like an option as a base.
Okay.
So you know what? We're like option 3 is a good base. Most of the schools we like, but let's just shuffle things around for Dr. David R. and Oakville 3, Princeton. So I'm not like, it doesn't need to be all, we can only move 1 zone. No, you can play around with it. It makes it easier for us if you say, well, starting with option 3, if we move this and this and this, and then we'll create a new option based on that. So it's just an easier way to express the moves around. And we can definitely explore that more next week. But also if you've got a couple that you want to spitball over the weekend and send over to us by Monday, we can definitely put those together and present them next Thursday. In addition to the ones we looked at.
My only concern was the new areas that are on the map that are still developing. We may think that these are all condos and most people coming to them are just, a single person or like a couple, but that most likely is not the case. So being in real estate, I can tell you that a lot of these people have children.
Absolutely. And I do want to tell you that in those zones, we've taken the approach of applying a higher yield for high density.
Okay.
10 years ago, we saw maybe 2-3 kids for 300 units. Now it is completely different. Like we're starting to see that inch towards, half of what we've seen in townhouses. And I think it's going to be higher, especially with affordability and a lot of immigration and all that coming in. And like we're seeing a lot of that. So no, be assured that in our high density, we're not assuming that there's going to be 10. We're assuming there's going to be a lot of kids.
Yeah, because the three that X, Y, and Z area has like, you know, if you think there's only going to be a few kids coming out of that area, that is not the case.
Oh, no. Like as an example here, if you look at that sheet Lorene put together for you for X, Y, and Z, like at peak, we're expecting like about 200 kids in that area.
Okay.
So we're expecting the worst and planning for the worst to make sure that we're not, again, doing this in 5 years.
And
Okay, perfect.
Magdas, the size of the, like each zone, each letter is around the same number of kids. So the fact that those are tiny tells you that they've taken into account that they're going to have a lot of kids in that small area.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. That's a good point. I'll keep that in mind.
And just further to that, no, I promise I talk less today, but so we look at how many kids are there existing, but also all the types and the number of units, and then we apply yield to that as to, you know, what we expect now, and especially this new trend. So the size, like you might see a massive one and there might be very little kids, or, you know, a lot. So it's all based on what we know in terms of development in there, and that's how we base it. So yeah, it's both what you're saying, Magnus, and that.
Okay, perfect. Now, the only reason I asked is because now I can, based on what I know, I can make up a little map and then possibly send it to you, and then you can look it over.
Absolutely. Whatever you guys want to do, map, zones, or whatever, we can connect and figure it out. All right. So with that, again, I know we went over time, so we'll close it out for tonight. Again, thank you so much for your participation and you know, going through this process with us. And I'm looking forward to next week.
Thank you.
Thank
Can I
you.
ask the BRC committee to stay on, please?
Thank you.